Nigeria's economy has now recorded a full-year uninterrupted expansion, with the latest Central Bank PMI data showing stronger output, rising new orders, and renewed momentum across key sectors. Agriculture led the surge, but industry and service also strengthened, signaling improved business confidence despite inflationary pressures and a tight monetary backdrop. As analysts assess whether this momentum is sustainable heading into 2026, deep questions remain about the structural direction of the economy and the policy choices that will shape its next phase of growth. Abiodun Kayode Alli, the Senior Manager at PwC Nigeria, joins me now. Good morning.
Good morning.
Yes, and let's get into it. I think the numbers that are out, one of the things that stood out for many is, yes, we've been preaching diversify the economy. How does this data that is out reflect how that is happening in our economy?
Okay, yeah, thank you for the question. So basically, the data speaks a lot about what purchasers are actually expecting, all right? It speaks to their expectation, what they've seen recently in terms of inputs and in terms of outputs. So there is that optimism that things are definitely going to get better. So there are expectations that with the improvements in the economy, they should actually see themselves acquiring more. The markets are positive, and there is that, like I said, there is that optimism things will definitely get better. And we've seen this from the recent GDP numbers that were released by the National Bureau of Statistics, right, which speaks to an approximately 4% growth. So everywhere, all over the, if you look at it from analysts, their predictions, things seem to be positive. And thanks to the reforms that the government has put in place, especially reforms such as the foreign exchange reforms, right? We've seen accretion, significant improvements in our forex. And this has also helped to stabilize the naira, okay? And if you consider even our most important sector, even though its contribution isn't that much, the oil sector, we've seen improvements in our national oil company. So all these kind of signals a positive reform, because the entire sector is kind of interlinked, interwoven, right? So there is that positive vibes that purchasers are actually getting.
And I think you highlighted something I wanted to come to. We're seeing that the growth is largely driven by the non-oil sector. That contributed 96%. Oil sector, the production grew, but when you're looking at the sector's real growth, it's at 5.84%. That's a slowdown from previous periods. And we know oil is our main source of revenue. So it's good, and is it bad at the same time? Should we be concerned, or it's good that we're diversifying away from oil?
Yeah, so our economy, the interesting thing is that our economy has actually been diversified. It's actually a diversified economy. So the contribution of the oil sector has always been low, always been below 10%. And like you rightly said, this time it's even below 5%, like you said, right? But the thing is that despite the fact that the sector is widely diversified, oil sector still remains our highest revenue earners, right? Given the fact that the commodity is priced internationally, and also the fact that it's in high demand. Okay, so the expectation here is that as much as possible we can improve productivity, because consider the fact that that sector, in terms of employment, it's more of highly capital intensive compared to labor intensive, right? So a lot more needs to be done in terms of productivity. And once you're able to increase productivity, you will be able to engage more people, right? And also, if you look at it, connectivity, like I said earlier, all these sectors are interwoven, they're interconnected. The performance of the oil sector has a ripple effect on other aspects of the economy, right? Because everyone needs oil, right? In terms of the final output, and also in terms of the revenues that are being generated. So a lot more can still be done. Like you said, our production levels are quite low right now, even lower than what we had actually forecasted in the budget, right? So if we can do better, we will be able to improve on our reserves. And once you can improve on your reserves, the government has that power to actually stimulate the economy through its interventions. And that way you see a lot of businesses employing labor, right? Because that's actually the key concern of policymakers, to see how you can expand the economy. And if you even look further beyond the fact that Nigeria is currently interested in growing its economy by 2030, the $1 trillion economy, right? So there is a lot that the oil sector can contribute in actually making that a reality.
Mm-hmm. And you have mentioned something important, the government coming up with policies to stimulate growth. And let's come to agriculture now. It's driving growth. What structural reforms would you say are needed to ensure this momentum translate into long-term productivity rather than just a seasonal spike?
Yeah, and that's a very good question you've asked, right? So agriculture is, despite the fact that it's still in a primitive, it's practiced in somewhat of a primitive level in Nigeria. In terms of GDP contribution, it's always done something within the range of 25%. So it's more like contributing something significant, okay, to our economy. And if you consider the fact that agriculture is, if you compare it with what we have in advanced countries like South Africa, like the United Kingdom, the United States, you see that a small proportion of people are there, but in terms of output, they have significant amount of output. And this speaks to productivity, right? Watch each person, what the person is able to produce, right? And the only way you can actually increase productivity in that sector is through a transformation agenda, whereby you are moving from something that is more manual to something that is more mechanical, right? So in terms of incentives, a lot more needs to be done to stimulate productivity by providing technology, right? Providing any form of anything that would actually make production better. And I can list them. Apart from technology, you want to look at improvements in infrastructure as well. Okay, because infrastructure is one aspect that has not been, we can't say we've scored high in terms of having good routes, and not even the routes, I would say more of the rail in moving these items from where they are being produced to where they are being sold. Then I think also you would never look out from the area of security, right? We've had lots of insecurity incidences, a lot of displacement of farmers, okay, whereby they are no longer being productive, but rather they are staying in displaced centers, right, instead of working on the farm. So I think a lot more needs to be done in that regard. And I know the Federal Ministry of Agriculture and Food Security is doing a lot to stimulate even our youths, especially those in the urbanized regions, to actually look into agriculture, like the president's agenda to make farming more sexy, right? I know the government is doing a lot there, but I think they need to do more in terms of communication in that regards. But I won't say that apart from giving these recommendations, I won't say that the government isn't doing anything. So to some extent, I would still acknowledge some of the things they are doing, especially in terms of a fiscal and a tax reforms. The new tax laws, which are expected to kick off next month. I'm smiling because next month is just, before we're talking about months time next year, but it's just next month, right? Some of the provisions in the new laws has to do with some incentives like granting exemptions for those in the agricultural business for 5 years, making some of their produce exempt from VAT, some of the input materials like mechanical equipment, making them exempt from VAT. This is quite good. I do think a lot more can be done, especially with respect to the value addition aspect, right? With respect to agricultural process and value addition, because Nigeria no doubt produces a lot in terms of primary products, but we need to go beyond primary production to value addition. And that way we will be able to earn more forex from our exports, and we can then see agriculture competing with the likes of oil. Okay, so I think these are some of the things the government can still do.
Yeah, in terms of revenue, and hopefully we see them see through with some of these policies, and we see the results going into next month, next year. Now let's come to the PMI performance. Obviously, we've been focusing on that. We've seen a strong performance, stronger output. What would you say this signals about private sector confidence, especially with the backdrop of monetary policy, high inflation, even though this year it tempered, and of course FX pressures or stability?
Yeah, I think in terms of business confidence, I think it's actually good. So the PMI, if you collaborate it with other indicators, I think it gives that kind of positive signaling. And one thing I would say is that generally businesses, investors, they do believe that the reforms that the government has taken is actually leading to market expansion and creating of opportunities. And that's why most of these purchasers, especially in the manufacturing sector, can give that kind of positive outlook through the PMI, right? So it speaks a lot to expectations. But interestingly, it's just more of a short-term expectation, because you are looking, what the PMI is simply doing is that it's looking at indicators, right? Certain indicators that have occurred now and what it's speaking to in the nearest future, right? Next month, this month, right? That's what the PMI is relatively doing. But if you look at things from the long term, you've seen from certain indicators like the consumer confidence index, okay, as well as the business confidence index, we've seen a lot of positives, right? With people confident with things like the foreign exchange, right? The strengthening of the naira based on the policies that the CBN has put in place. So this has actually spiked up confidence. Okay. And like I said, once again, we've seen this in the GDP figures all coming out. But I think with respect to inflation, inflation in itself has also been a positive indicator. Not just the fact that it's dropped significantly, but also the direction. We've seen inflation drop over time. And most of these investors and businesses, they are looking at something that leads to, that you can call stable, that gives that stability, right? So inflation has been trending downwards. That's a positive, okay? Then also the fact that the naira has been stabilizing over time. That's also another positive. So all these things, and as well as the policies that are coming, that are taking effect next year. I spoke about the tax reforms, how that a lot of Nigerians will then begin to see their purchasing power increase because of some of the provisions in there that speaks to individuals earning below 1 million, not even paying taxes at all, or businesses earning 100 million, not paying taxes at all. All these things speaks to positive expectation as a result of government policies, right? So there is a lot of uptick there. But then you can't ignore what is often referred to as adaptive expectation, right? Human beings would always predict the future based on what has occurred in the past. And knowing that we're entering into 2026, that's a pre-election year, right? So we'll begin to see a lot of pullback in some of the activities of MDAs of government, right? So I would say it's kind of mixed as we head towards 2026. Initially, it's going to be positive, but as we are getting towards the end of 2026, you would expect a reduction in investments, right? And I would expect that by now the government can do more to actually improve on this confidence of businesses by passing on the budget, right? And the quick implementation of that, even though we've not been too good with respect to implementation. So I think in summary, I think businesses are actually quite hopeful.
Indeed, the private sector. Now let's come to, we're seeing from the data, we're seeing a rise in new orders across industry and services. How should the policymakers perhaps interpret that? And is it a sign of perhaps a real demand recovery, or is it just simply inventory replacement after months of suppressed activity?
Yeah, and that's a very interesting question, right? So with these positives we've seen, these positives that we've seen in terms of orders, all right, policymakers, one important thing they should always be, or one important thing they're always concerned about are things such as job creation as well as improved standard of living. So I think in this regards, one thing they can do is to stimulate the economy, and that's why we have I forgot the name of the industry. There is a particular sector that was headed by Jumoke Oduwole, right? That had to do with business facilitation, basically, right? So that's exactly what they should be focused on right now. How can you stimulate the economy? What incentives can you give to producers, to manufacturers, to businesses to begin to thrive? One key area you can actually make a gigantic impact would be in terms of power infrastructure, okay? Making sure that there is available power for businesses to be able to carry out their operations. Then I think a lot more can be done with respect to training of individuals. You know quite well that Africa has a very youthful population, including Nigeria, right? A lot of our youths are currently not being employed to full capacity. So I think a lot more needs to be done in terms of training and in terms of carrying out an act of intermediation between schools as well as the private sector, schools, as well as any organ of government that can employ them. So I think with that, you will begin to see increased productivity at the end of the day. And this all ties down to the government's agenda to actually improve the standard of living, right? So, and I think the reforms that the government is putting in place, both from a fiscal side as well as a monetary side, would be quite helpful. From a monetary side, the only thing I would expect would be that they would probably lower rates, right? Because lowering rates would actually make credit more affordable, right? Affordable to the private sector. So I think a lot more needs to be done in that regard. And one other thing I would say lastly is that as much as possible, government needs to ensure that it doesn't stifle the private sector in terms of lending, right? Through a lot of borrowing, right, and debt servicing. That way, we have the private sector being able to get money, and once the real sector has that money, it can actually employ people, and this leads to higher wages, higher living standards, and more taxes for government in the long run.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, broadly speaking, looking at the data, it would be interesting to see how this data should influence decision making going forward, especially from the government side in terms of spending, from the central bank, the Monetary Policy Committee in terms of interest rates, liquidity tightening, forex reform. So looking at the data, how should it influence decision making on that end?
Yeah, so the data broadly speaks to it broadly speaks to the manufacturing sector, right? So going beyond the manufacturing sector, I do think that at this point in time, we should be looking at a kind of broad-based growth, right? Broad-based, right? Not just the manufacturing sector, but also the service sector, right? So I've spoken previously about what the Monetary Policy Committee can do in terms of lowering rates, because they were actually holding on to rates as a result of the high inflation we've had. But given that data is showing that inflation is trending downward, there is stability in FX. So a lot more needs to be done in trying to make liquidity available from that regards. Okay. Then I've also mentioned the fact that it's quite important that we stimulate growth, right, by investing in critical infrastructure at this point in time. We've seen lots of investments going on in terms of road infrastructure, which is quite helpful. If government can begin to consolidate on these efforts and make funds readily available for most of these contractors in a long way, that would actually stimulate productive activities. Then you also want to look at some of the incentives that has to do with export. A lot of our producers are currently struggling with exporting most of their items, right? And this has to do with some of the policies that we have at the customs, right? If there is a way we can actually make and stimulate export of items through simplifying most of our rules, our procedures, right? That would in a long way help in generating revenue for these individuals and also increasing our reserves, right? So I think beyond all these things, government needs to stay true to its word in terms of policies. It's one thing to have a policy, it's also another thing to actually implement these things. So I think government needs to show that commitment to implementation. We've seen the fact that we started implementing, I think it was sometime in July, we started implementing the 2025 budget. I do think a lot more needs to be done to hasten this. There's been delays in passing the 2026 budget, and this actually gives a kind of signal to foreign investors, right? So I do think government needs to pay attention to some of these things while it's also dealing with other things like the pre-election year, right? So these are some of the things I'll still say regarding this question you've asked.
Right, a full year of uninterrupted expansion for the Nigerian economy. Thank you for your thoughts on how the government can continue to sustain this momentum. Abiodun Kayode Alli, Senior Manager, PwC Nigeria.
Yeah, thank you for having me.